The name of the film you just watched was called Brooklyn. It starred Saoirse Ronan. That's a good Cinema Club quiz. How do you pronounce her name? She says it's pronounced Saoirse in traditional Irish. And that's the way I guess she pronounces it when she's in Ireland. But when she's talking to people from North America, she says Saoirse. Anyway, it also stars Emery Cohen, Jim Broadbent, who's in everything these days, and Julie Walters. It was adapted from the Colm Toabin book by Nick Hornby, and it was directed by John Crowley. Fox Searchlight Pictures acquired the distribution rights to the film at the 2015 Sundance Film Festival with a record deal of $9 million. So, yeah, they obviously had a lot of faith in this movie. What did you guys think of the music? Oh, good. I'm glad you like the music because we're going to talk with the composer of this score. His name is Michael Brook, and he is a Canadian Golden Globe and Grammy-nominated composer, producer, and recording artist. He's recognized for his unique style of composition that traverses ambient, world, Americana, electronic, and orchestral territories, as you heard in this. His work often contains unusual combinations of instruments, sounds, and moods that create a powerful, unique, and emotional impact. His music career began as a recording artist, guitar player, producer, and collaborator. He worked with artists like Brian Eno, David Sylvian, The Pogues, and Jane Silbury on groundbreaking labels such as 4AD and Real World Records. And as his music, his songs, I guess, began to be licensed in films like Heat and Any Given Sunday, the Oliver Stone movie, he developed an interest in composing for film, and he moved to Los Angeles from the United Kingdom in 1999. Among the notable films that he has scored are The Perks of Being a Wallflower, The Fighter, Into the Wild, the Sean Penn film, Chavez, Aloft, Country Strong, The Vow, the Oscar-winning documentary An Inconvenient Truth, and the Oscar-winning documentary Undefeated from last year. Also, he scored the soon-to-be-seen transgender drama About Ray, and the movie that you just had the pleasure of watching, Brooklyn, which, again, debuted earlier this year at Sundance and will be released next week here in the South Bay and the following week in Sacramento. So, is that Michael up there? Michael, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so give Michael a hand for that music.
Thank you.
Okay, so Michael, first question, I guess, since a film is what? It's a director's medium, right? But you obviously had to come up with the soul of this movie in a way. So can you describe your working relationship with the director, John Crowley, and how that influenced how you put this thing to music?
Well, I think there's always a degree of collaboration with directors on film scores. This was an unusually detailed collaboration, and I think John had an unusually detailed and well worked out emotional map as to what both of the film as a whole and also what he wanted the music to do. So it was great because he's obviously had a couple of years to think about it, and sometimes I only get, a few weeks to work on a film. So if somebody really has a sense of what they want emotionally to happen, that can help me a lot.
He said that he divided the movie into three different visual movements. He said the first movement is before Ellis leaves post-war Ireland, and he said it was with tight frames. He filmed it in tight frames, and he filled it with green tones. He said the color scheme was created by photographic references of the time. The second movement began when Ellis left for Brooklyn, and the first proper wide shot is featured, while the colors became more playful as a nod to how America in 1952 was on the cusp of pop culture kicking off. The third movement, he said, is back in Ireland, brighter, more with more glamour and subtly more colorful than the first movement. Crowley also said that he wanted to visually showcase how Ellis had changed, contending that there was a slight dreamy quality to the last third. Are those the kind of things he did that visual plan affect how you chose to score the movie?
It wasn't expressed in those terms, but yeah, it did. And the general consensus is that you say her name Ailish, but no one's ever going to win the game of guessing how to pronounce an Irish word or name. I mean, it's you're always going to get it wrong. But yeah, he did. And at the beginning, we wanted to refer to the place of Ireland, but not do sort of fake Irish music or anything. And same when we went to America, where we started to have the slightly more perky things happening, especially when you meet Tony, the American boyfriend. So there's a bit of upright bass and clarinet, but we didn't want to be very literal in the way we did any of that. His goal was to have a subtle acknowledgement and reinforcement of where we were.
Would you or do you? Would you say that you have an affinity for, I don't know, like the quote unquote Irish sound? I don't know what that means, but
I never thought of it that way. I think in the sense of some of the like the older Irish music, like the singer in the film earlier, O'Leonard sings, where there's almost a kind of Middle Eastern feel to some of that, in that there's a bit of an emphasis on ornamentation or how you go from one note to the other. And I've always been attracted to musics like that, like Indian music and so on. But I think I'm not sort of a scholar of that type of music or anything. I'm a bit of a fan.
Yeah. Miklos Rosa, who scored Ben-Hur and a ton of other great films, he said that the function of music in movies is not to illustrate, but to complete the psychological effect. Brian De Palma, when he was working on Obsession, and he was working with Bernard Herrmann, he said Herrmann was the master of giving a whole emotional subtext to the character. That is, that's what made the film Obsession work. And Elmer Bernstein said, I really do think that under ideal circumstances, the music should be a character in a movie. So I guess the question is, what do you see as the function of the role of the film composer in a film like this?
Well, and it does. I'm glad you had sort of radically different examples, because my experience is that every film is totally different in terms of what the music can bring to the table. I think in this one, it's a bit of an outlier for me, in the sense that we very strongly tried to sort of, I suppose, underscore what was going on inside people's heads. Because often what was going on the screen would have been moderately static. And like, for example, and I'm glad you mentioned what John had said about going back to Ireland, because for I didn't quite get it for a while, where he kept referring to this almost mystical, ethereal, dreamy feel, like when they go to the Irish beach and they're climbing the hill before they get to see the water. And I think that's a good example of where, it's just four people walking on a beach. And John wanted this sort of fairly big, almost ecstatic sense in the score, which I think worked incredibly well. But at first I was struggling with it, because I kind of didn't understand, in the sense that it wasn't even that anybody was going through some big ecstatic sense. It was more a kind of subtle reconnection that Ailish was making with Ireland. And what was going on in terms of what you saw on the screen and what in terms of the characters' heads was not nearly as passionate and as emotional as what the music was. But, it was a sort of a smart strategic move, in that it set up that thing. It kind of said, well, Ailish is probably going to start having some strong feelings about this pretty soon. And that was just the beginning of it.
Well, I thought what I thought was so amazing about this score, as a music score, a film score, is how it walked a very fine line between doing that thing that I thought Herman did so well, which was to sort of like create this psychological sort of subtext. You were aware of the music occasionally, but just as a viewer and as somebody who studies film music sort of ravenously, I never once felt manipulated, but yet I was deeply moved by it. There's that, and I want you to comment on that. And also, where music wasn't used, I thought was fascinating. Where it could have been used and wasn't, in different scenes, like when Ailish's mother says goodbye to her and says, "I just want to say goodbye to you once." You could cut the silence, with a pin. You could hear a pin drop during, and then, but when the scene is over, there's sort of some ominous tones. There's a number of scenes like that where there's no music, where you thought, well, maybe music would have worked here. Can you talk about that? About knowing when to use music and when to not.
Well, I'm kind of at one end of the spectrum generally. It's not just because I'm lazy, but I prefer less music in films generally, and I think often, and I often lose that battle, and maybe I'm wrong, but to me it feels like the music can add so much more to a film if it's not wallpapered all the way through it. And I think the scene you mentioned is a good example of it, where, first of all, the scene itself is more stark and I think, emotionally hard-hitting without the music in it. And then afterwards, and directly following that, is kind of the longest cue in the film, which is a big cue. And I think it works because it's been set up properly. And I think that was something John was very careful about. And we did a lot of experimenting to try and, are we pushing too hard? Are we not pushing hard enough? And, there was a lot of tweaking that went into getting that balance.
Yeah, well, I think it was hugely successful just from an artistic standpoint, and just from a basic craftsmanship standpoint, it was phenomenal. Did you said that you mentioned the scene on the beach and how difficult that was. It sounds like John Crowley sort of had a sense of what he wanted from the music. Do you find that directors in general are that concerned with music like that? Or, just has any director ever let you just say, well, go ahead, do what you want? And if I like it, I'll tell you. If I don't, I won't. And then you can start from the beginning again or whatever. Yeah.
It covers a really huge range. I think also John had strong ideas about what he wanted, and some of which turned out to be wrong. And one of the there's the scene, and also there's nothing wrong with working. We all get things wrong at the beginning, or we often do, and that's an integral part of the experimental aspect of the process that I like, because you sort of get bad surprises and good surprises, and then all you do is throw the bad ones away. But the great thing about working with John was that he would admit that the idea didn't work, and he was and sometimes that's a bit of a struggle where often directors they're a little insecure about dealing with music because they feel they don't have the vocabulary or the music skills, and so they're kind of they're tense and anxious when they talk about it. And sometimes we'll do something and it's not working, but they can't articulate why, and so it kind of all goes a bit weird. But with John, where the scene I was thinking of that's the best example is when Ailish and Tony go swimming at Coney Island, and she's talking, there's a voiceover of her reading her letter, saying how great everything's going, and then it's cutting back and forth between her sister dying or being dead. And initially, John wanted the tragedy of that to start, I think, just as they go swimming. And of course, you don't know what's happening, and initially, and it goes against what you're hearing. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, it always felt like we were trying to push something in an artificial way. And eventually we became a little more literal in following the emotional map of what was happening. And so at the beginning, it's kind of cheerful and having a good time, and then transitions into the tragedy of her sister dying.
You mentioned sometimes it's you don't have very much time. Did you have sufficient time to work on this score? You read when the movies were factories and the studio system was in place, that oftentimes composers they'd come in and be told, you have to score this 2.5 hour epic and you have 3 weeks to do it. What was that process like for you on this film?
Well, a general comment is that I find constraints of which schedule can be one. They're often, I think, creatively motivating. And like the worst thing you can do is sort of give someone unlimited resources a lot of the time. And so I don't have a problem with that. And the range has sort of been, I think, like Undefeated, the documentary you mentioned, there was 3 weeks to score that, and which is kind of crazy. And yeah, and and by the way, when I say I appreciate it, it's also a nightmare, and I don't appreciate it at the time. But in retrospect, those things can really cause you to do things in an uninhibited way sometimes, or an unperfected way that sometimes has a little something to it that you might not get in other situations. With this one, there was kind of a bit of both, because the original schedule was reasonable, but not for the process we went through. John was very upfront at the beginning that he wanted to try things. For example, the scene I mentioned earlier, and that takes time to make it plan A, to make it presentable so that you can evaluate it. Takes time, and then if that doesn't work, going to plan B or plan C takes time. And the original schedule didn't really allow for that, and so there was a lot of tension about the fact that we clearly were not going to meet the original schedule, but that was just because of the way we were doing things. And I think, I don't know if it was sort of a strategy on John's part or just sort of ended up that way. Eventually, I think we spent about 12 weeks on it, maybe a little more.
That seems like a pretty decent amount of time.
Yeah, it was. The problem was we spent the first 6 weeks getting ready to finish by the end of that 6 weeks. And so then we had to kind of backtrack a bit and so on.
It's interesting what you said, and this will come as no surprise to anybody, obviously, but the whole nature of film scoring, I guess, is very restrictive in the sense that, you're restricted by the length of a scene, right? Of a particular scene. Mm-hmm. So you might have to write some like really great music that lasts like a minute and 22 seconds, and hit all the right spots that it needs to hit. That to me would seem like a maddening prospect to have to do that.
Well, it's just sort of the name of the game in a way. It's probably closer to what it used to be like when composers would have a patron, like the king would say, "Hey, can you knock out a mass for my nephew who's coming into town tomorrow?" needs to be about 22 minutes and 15 seconds long. It's a bit like that, but it's the thing I like about the whole process is the collaborative side of it, where working with other people brings things to the music that a single mind will not. And I find there's a synergistic aspect to it where the music ends up better than either person could have done.
What did the ensemble look like? Was it the instrumentation, the players? Was it a small ensemble? And what kind of instruments did you use? This morning I thought there was a banjo in the score, but you said it was, or a mandolin, and you said it was a kind of a guitar that was used?
Yeah, it's called an octave guitar. I think it's on the wall behind you.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, there
I
it
don't know
is.
if you can see it.
So you're in your studio right now?
Yeah.
Look at that. That's very cool. Yeah. Oh, so it's the guitar on the right next to the round thing?
Yeah, here, I'll get it.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, it's that. Yeah. So can you? Yeah. Oh, I'm going to ask you to play some of it a little bit. Yeah.
It's this thing, which is
See, that sounds like a uke.
yeah. It's just a 6-string tiny guitar.
So did you do things in the sound mixing to make it sound more? I don't know. It didn't quite sound like that in the movie, to me.
No, well, the parts were different. I can't remember what the parts were, but no, I didn't do anything to it. It is the reasonably natural sound of the instrument itself. Then there was there's the solo violin that kind of became a bit of the theme or the motif for Ailish that my wife Julie Rogers played. And then there's in London we recorded a string section, pretty big for me anyway, and piano, clarinet, and upright bass.
And you didn't use no percussion or anything, right?
There's no percussion. There's a couple of instruments, like when when Ailish is homesick in her room at night. There's some kind of ethereal little instruments that are in the background that are like a zither that's been sampled and manipulated to sound more just like a sustained instrument. But no, it didn't really call for percussion.
Yeah. When you after all the mixing and whatever, all the putting it together, so when you saw it for the first time, what was your reaction? What was your impression? Did it seem like what you had thought it was going to play like, next to the scenes, or did you, what was that like? What was your reaction?
Oh, by the way, I just realized something. There's a scene that I might have been slightly misleading you. The scene where she gets seasick, and that actually is not this instrument. That's it's a Turkish kind of a banjo-y type of instrument. Yeah, you know what? The reason I went somewhere else is because I forgot about that because we cut that piece of music, and then it ended up being put back in. Yeah. Yeah. It's I can't remember. It's like a Bazantar or some name like that. But oh yeah. Well, I recorded the music in London and then mixed it in Bath in England. But then I didn't stay for the final mix of the film where the music is actually mixed into the film with all the dialogue and that. And then when it was showing at Sundance, I went to Sundance, but there were 2 films that I had scored there, and the schedules were kind of interlocked, so that I went to the like the red carpet stuff for one, and then they showed the movie, but I had to leave and go to some function of the other film, and they were sort of sandwiched. So I never got to see it until September in Toronto. And well, quite honestly, it's the best mix of the music I've worked on in a film I've ever had. So I was like more than pleasantly shocked, because usually often it's a disappointment.
Yeah, yeah. Does anybody have any questions? I'm kind of monopolizing this conversation here. Here's Sue here.
One thing I enjoyed with this is that it seems that a lot of movies now, they'll use music to manipulate the entire scene, to manipulate what's going on. And I found yours, it was much more gentle in that rather than pushing a scene, it was more as a reaction rather than forming it. I don't know if that had any bearing to you.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. That was a very that was one of our largest goals, and that's why there was a lot of trying to find the right balance of things, because I think that philosophy is sort of in every part of the film, where just when you think it's going to get cheesy, somehow it veers away from it. And I think one of the bigger goals was to kind of support the emotion, but never push it. And actually, I met the author of the book the other night, Colin Tobin, and I had never met him before, and he was saying that he really appreciated the fact that it's not trying to be Irish music. It's maybe trying to give a nodding reference to it at times, but not faking it. And he said, whenever Irish audiences hear, anything but the real deal in a film, they instantly dismiss it. So I think the goal was always to be supportive and sort of enhancing, but never manipulating or sort of telling people what to feel.
I was wondering, when you were scoring it, did you start sort of page one of the script and then work your way through, or did you, like, in what order were you trying to do the scenes for the scoring for it? Was there any certain order you went through, or?
Well, the way I work is I like to just sort of do a lot of sketches, not necessarily thinking where they will go, or even if they will end up in the film. And so I like to sort of grab ideas or whatever it seems to inspire in a non-goal oriented way, and then almost semi-randomly try them against scenes in the film. And so what that can end up doing is that the pieces that seem to work and that stick might be semi-randomly scattered throughout the film. But I tend to work, all things being equal, I'll work somewhat chronologically, because usually you develop something for later in the film, and you want to see if that basic idea is going to work earlier.
Michael, what do you think of the state of the art of film composition is today? I ask that because, do you think good music is being written for films? Because I'll just come out and say, it's interesting. I think most of the music, that was written before, maybe 1970, 1975 for films, a large portion of it is memorable music to me. A lot of what's being written now, I think, is technically dazzling. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad music, but it isn't memorable in the sense that, like, a lot of the classic scores, like the stuff that Elmer Bernstein wrote and Eric Korngold and Max Steiner and Maurice Jarre, all those people, you don't have that today. So I'm curious if you think that good music being written for films today? Aside from your stuff, of course. Yeah.
Well, in certain ways, I might not be qualified to say, but in that I don't get to see a lot of films, and I think times have changed a little bit in that you're right. I mean, it used to be there were very clear themes, and it was music with a melody. And partly there's been a sort of, I think, a drive towards incorporate maybe what you might call more ambient levels in ideas into scores these days, where it might not have a clear melody. And that's just, I think, culture moving on. But also, I think there's a general drift maybe in film to always, in contemporary film, there's always a little bit of a sense of irony and sort of holding back what the genuine emotion is, or sort of committing to something emotionally. And that can work, and it's enjoyable. You know, say like Quentin Tarantino's films, which are hugely, I love watching them. And I slightly feel guilty because it feels like, well, I felt more invested with the characters in Brooklyn, say, emotionally. It felt like nobody was trying to pretend or distance themselves from what they were going through emotionally. Whereas, you know, when there's a lot of sort of overly graphic or detailed violence or things like that, I think we just pull back from it a bit, and we don't treat it as real, although it still has a visceral effect on us, I think. And I'm not saying that disapprovingly or one way or the other. And I think these days it can be considered, you know, cornily retro if you have themes and that kind of thing, or overt melodies. But also I think it's just, you know, some people like Cliff Martinez, who he'll do stuff that definitely has ambient elements, and I like it a lot. I don't think maybe it sort of wears its heart on a sleeve as much as some of the music you referred to, as in some ways the films don't.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I read just recently, just thinking ahead, talking to you, Henry Mancini. This shocked me. Henry Mancini, who's I always thought was a songwriter, said he never wrote, when he wrote scores for his films, and he's done a number of memorable scores. He said he used the leitmotif method, and he focused on melody. And then somebody like Johnny Mercer came along, whatever, and wrote lyrics to the songs. And then the producers of the film then promoted the song to, you know, increase attendance at the movie. But he was saying things like Moon River and Charade and Days of Wine and Roses, this stuff were all written as scores. I don't know what my point is, other than I thought that was really interesting, that out of the process, in a way, some of what you're describing came these wonderful melodies and these, you know, memorable themes.
Yeah, I didn't know that about him, but that is interesting. I know on Into the Wild, there was a sort of, there are songs by Eddie Vedder in it, and we didn't collaborate, although sometimes I think some of the cues slightly directed the direction of a song, but and vice versa. But there was no connection like you're talking about with Mancini.
A lady in the morning who was trying to get to the microphone, I couldn't get to her, or whatever. She wanted me to ask you what your record collection looks like.
Well, it looks like a hard drive now. Yeah, I just have everything I've gathered over the years. And I don't really get a chance to listen to much music anymore. Mostly I listen to stuff in the car and I don't go out much because I work at home. So if I'm taking my son to school or picking him up, we mostly just listen to the Beatles, which has been great, actually, to revisit all that stuff. But I don't. I have a huge amount of music, but I don't know if I could say anything meaningful about it. Quite a bit of world music, and then of course film stuff, and then just things I've collected over the years.
Yeah, yeah. I've been told we've been going on almost 40 minutes here and they got to start another movie. So I just want to say, in conclusion that I really appreciate you taking the time talking to our group today. I think your score, I hate even saying this because it sounds like I'm pandering and because you're on the screen here and you're our guest and I'm trying to be nice, but I mean this. I really think you're going to win the Academy Award this year for best score. It's the best score I've heard in any film in years. So the movie again is Brooklyn. If you liked it, spread the word. And please give Michael Brook another hand for doing this. Michael, thank you so much. Really, it's been great.
Great talking to you. And it sounds like a really cool thing you have going there. I wish I'd heard about it sooner when I lived up there.
Yeah, well, next time we'll get you here in person. We'll fly you down. Okay?
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.